Hi, my name is Daniela, and although I am only 31 years old, sometimes it seems to me that I live several lives at once. Because working in a large corporation with its endless reports, meetings, and evening calls from the boss requires not only attentiveness, but also incredible patience. But it was this that allowed me to save up for my own home and finally experience that quiet joy that a person experiences when closing the door of an apartment that belongs only to him, even if it is just a modest 3-room apartment in a decent area, without frills, but with coziness that I created gradually, buying furniture, carpets, small paintings, and little things that remind me of travels. My family has always been my support. My parents, who are retired but still cheerful, loving and caring, and my older sister Sarah, who is 34 years old, a woman with a strong character and a stubborn outlook on life. The mother of 3 boys, each of whom is like a separate element, requiring constant attention and patience. Matteo, the eldest at 10 years old, already learned to look at the world with some kind of defiant skepticism. Alessandro at 7 was more like a little explorer, ready at any moment to create chaos for the sake of curiosity. And Gustavo, who had just turned 5, seemed the most restless spark because he was either laughing or crying or screaming, and there were almost no intermediate states in his behavior. When Sarah divorced her husband last year, none of us were particularly surprised because their constant quarrels had long since become an integral part of family gatherings. And frankly, I sometimes caught myself thinking that the divorce would bring her even more relief than pain. And so it turned out, especially considering that her ex-husband regularly paid alimony, allowing her not to feel driven into a corner. She got a part-time job at a marketing agency, and although the salary was small, for her it became a source of self-confidence, and I helped her by paying the rent of the apartment, because $800 a month is a tangible amount for the budget, but affordable for me. And I believe that family is not words, but actions, and if you can make life easier for a loved one, then this is exactly what should be done. However, the way Sarah raised her sons sometimes seemed to me to be something completely impossible. She sincerely believed in the theory of free education, where children grow up without boundaries and rules, find their own limits, and thus become free, independent individuals. And although in words it sounded inspiring, in reality it all boiled down to the fact that the boys behaved as if the world belonged exclusively to them, and any attempt to limit them was perceived as an encroachment on their freedom. Several times I agreed to look after them when Sarah needed to solve work issues or go on business, and each time it turned into an ordeal. It was worth her only to leave the children on my doorstep, quickly kiss me on the cheek, and throw out, "You are the best," on the go, and my house immediately turned into an arena for children's experiments. Matteo would take the couch without a trace of embarrassment, grab the remote and turn on the TV as if it were his territory. Alessandro would open the fridge and rummage through it, choosing whatever he wanted without even thinking to ask. And Gustavo would start whining, demanding toys, screaming loudly or stamping his feet if he didn't get what he wanted. When I tried to gently explain that it would be nice to at least ask permission before taking food, or that jumping on the furniture with shoes on was unacceptable, they would look at me as if I was speaking a foreign language. And then Matteo would cross his arms over his chest and say his favorite phrase, "You can't tell us what to do." And every time something inside me would clench painfully because I wasn't used to being a guest in my own apartment. But that's how I felt around them. The last time I agreed to help was only because Sarah begged me. She had meetings to attend and no one to leave the boys with, and I, not wanting to let my sister down, sighed and opened the door. She promised to be back by 5, but by noon, as soon as they entered, the usual chaos had descended on my house. Matteo had taken over the TV again, Alessandro had gone into the kitchen, and Gustavo had started complaining that he was bored, demanding attention every second. And that was when something happened that changed my attitude to what was happening completely. Alessandro, seeing the ceramic vase I had brought from Italy and standing on the coffee table, started throwing the ball in the living room. And when I asked him to take the game outside, he only grinned, throwing it higher and higher, and Gustavo, laughing, joined in with a pillow, and in a matter of minutes, my living room turned into an arena of crazy games. I asked them to stop again, but they didn't seem to hear me, and then the inevitable happened. The ball thrown by Alessandro bounced off the table and hit a vase, which fell to the floor with a dull clang and shattered into dozens of pieces. And at that moment, I felt anger and fatigue fill every cell of my body. The boys froze, looking at me, and only Matteo shrugged and said, "Oops." And then I realized that I couldn't stand it anymore. I went to the TV, took the remote control, turned it off with a sharp movement, and looking at them with a stern look said, "All three of you, sit on the sofa." And they, perhaps for the first time hearing in my voice not a request, but an order, obeyed and silently sat down next to each other, warily looking at me, waiting for what would happen next. "What are you doing?" Alessandro asked, his voice more challenging than curious, as if he was expecting to hear something that would give him a reason to argue. "I set some boundaries in my own house," I replied firmly, feeling a tired but firm irritation building inside me. "You just broke something that belonged to me." In my house, when someone breaks something, they sit quietly and think about what they did wrong. No TV, no running around, just sit until your mother comes home. I noticed Gustavo was about to jump off the couch, but I calmly, without raising my voice, pointed to his seat and said, "Sit." He froze in surprise, then came back and sat down obediently. In that moment, I felt like for the first time they saw me not as an aunt who was ready to tolerate everything, but as an adult who was better not to be contradicted. They sat on the couch for the next 3 hours while I picked up the pieces of the broken vase, carefully swept the floor, threw away what couldn't be saved, and tried to push the irritation out of my mind, replacing it with cold calm. There was an almost oppressive silence in the room, broken only by my steps and the scraping of the dustpan on the wooden floor, and the boys themselves apparently didn't understand how it happened that the fun had ended so suddenly. They exchanged glances, sometimes whispered something barely audible to each other, but generally sat quietly, as if they were afraid that any movement would cause a new explosion in me. For me, this unexpected silence was almost bliss. 3 hours without TV, without shouting and stomping. 3 hours when order reigned in my house. When Sarah returned at 5 o'clock sharp, I had just finished tidying up the living room, and as soon as she stepped through the door, the boys jumped up, ran up to her, and began vying with each other to complain about me, as if they had been preparing a list of accusations. "She made us sit still," Alessandro said indignantly, as if that were the worst punishment in the world. "She didn't let us watch TV," Matteo added resentfully. "And she was very angry with us," Gustavo added, trying to look especially miserable. Sarah turned pale, then blushed sharply, and her eyes turned to me with such reproach, as if I had just hit them. "How dare you treat my children like that?" Her voice shook with rage, and I felt my indignation begin to boil inside me. "You had no right to punish them." "They are only children, Daniela." I pointed my hand at the trash can where I had put the broken vase and said, "They broke my vase after I asked them several times to stop throwing things in the living room, but Sarah just waved me off. It was an accident. You're being cruel because of a stupid vase. Cruel." The word stabbed me like a knife. I felt my voice getting louder, harder, sharper. "Sarah, they destroyed my home while you were gone. I asked them nicely, but they just laughed at me and did what they wanted. What could I do? Watch everything break before my eyes? I'm a person too, and I have the right to respect in my own home." But she wasn't really listening to me anymore. She just repeated her mantra, "You have to let them be themselves. That's why children grow up happy, creative, free. You don't understand children. You're too strict." Those words, "You're cruel. You don't understand," echoed in my head. I'd spent the entire day cleaning up after her sons, putting up with their antics, trying to gently explain at first what was allowed and what wasn't, but apparently, in her mind, the desire for simple order and respect was equated with heartless strictness. I took a deep breath and then said in a cold tone, "Okay. If you think I'm cruel, if your boys are strangers to me, as you just made clear, then perhaps strangers really don't have the right to come into my house and break my things. Find someone else to look after them when you need help." Sarah turned pale. Her lips trembled, but she didn't answer. She grabbed the boys' jackets abruptly and began to hastily pull them on, muttering under her breath about how unbearable I was. The boys, sensing that their mother was clearly on their side, also cast sideways glances at me as if I were an enemy, and then they left, slamming the front door so loudly that the walls of my house shook. Sarah didn't even say goodbye. After that argument, I felt relief, albeit bitter. I thought that I was finally free of chaos, that I would no longer have to listen to endless noise, clean up after other people's children, put up with the destruction of my comfort and the transformation of my apartment into a playground. For 2 weeks, I lived as if I had regained my freedom. I came home from work, enjoyed the silence, turned on the TV and watched what I wanted, ate in a clean kitchen, went to bed without a headache. But then Saturday came, and as usual, I went to dinner at my parents', because it was our family tradition and I couldn't refuse. And there I saw the same thing that used to happen at my house, only now my parents had to bear this cross. The boys, as always, took the main places at the table, argued with each other, interrupted the adults, threw pieces of bread and pieces of meat, spilled juice, as if it was a game. The parents tried to call them to order, but the boys only laughed, and everything turned into chaos instead of a quiet family evening. Sarah, as always, sat with her phone in her hands, typing messages and smiling at the screen, as if what was happening next to her did not matter at all. When I asked her to restrain the children at least a little, she did not even look up and said, "It's none of your business, Daniela." The parents just looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders, as if admitting their helplessness. After every dinner, it ended the same way. Sarah would leave with the boys, and my parents would sigh wearily and ask me to stay and help clean up the remains of the feast. Food on the floor, sticky marks everywhere, broken plates. It all became a new ritual. And that's when I began to notice that the fatigue I had tried to push out of my life was returning again. Only now it had migrated from my apartment to my parents' house, and I had to bear witness to how chaos destroyed their familiar comfort, just as it once destroyed mine. This happened almost every Saturday, and I saw how my parents were getting more and more tired, although they tried not to show it, smiling at the table and patiently straightening the napkins, which the children immediately turned into paper balls. But the wrinkles of fatigue around their eyes became deeper, and after each dinner, they no longer concealed their heavy sighs when the boys left with Sarah, leaving behind chaos that required a long and painstaking restoration. This whole situation drove me crazy, but I did not know what to do with it. I did not want to quarrel with Sarah again, because I understood that her stubbornness would only aggravate the conflict, but I also could not come to terms with the fact that family dinners were turning into a test and not a joy. Then November came. The air grew damp and chilly, the store windows filled with autumn decorations, and I suddenly realized that Thanksgiving was fast approaching, and the thought of having to spend the entire holiday observing the chaos and wiping up sticky stains that neither tablecloths nor patience could remove made me feel almost physically sick. That's when an idea occurred to me. What if instead of going to my parents' house this year, I threw my own celebration at home, the way I'd always wanted it to be, calm, beautiful, filled with conversation and real comfort? I called my mother and carefully told her that I wouldn't be coming to dinner this year. "What do you mean you're not coming?" "It's Thanksgiving, and we always spend it together," my mother asked, surprised, and I could almost hear the worry in her voice. "I know, Mom," I said, "but I want to try hosting dinner at my own house. I'm going to have my own celebration." There was a long pause, after which she asked quietly, "Daniela, is it because of Sarah and the boys?" I couldn't lie to her. "Partly, yes. I just want to have a quiet day for once." Mom sighed heavily, but there was no judgment in her voice. I understand, dear. And I really think you're right. After that conversation, I started reaching out to relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, all the people who usually gathered at my parents' house. I envisioned it as a more intimate gathering, but with one clear stipulation: no children under 15 allowed. This is going to be an adults-only party, I told Aunt Linda, adding that I wanted a more sophisticated atmosphere where people could talk calmly without interrupting each other or raising their voices to be heard over the screaming and running around. Most of the relatives supported the idea. Uncle Mike even laughed when he heard about the restriction. I love kids, but sometimes it's nice to finish a sentence and eat. Aunt Carol was even more enthusiastic. Oh, thank God. I dreaded the thought of another holiday dinner with those boys running around and screaming. Don't get me wrong, I love them, but the holiday is supposed to be fun, not a pain in the ass. And I felt like my idea really had a chance. By the end of the week, I had 8 people confirmed, and they all seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of a quiet, grown-up celebration. On the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I was in my kitchen planning the menu, going through recipes and putting away groceries when my phone buzzed with a text. It was Sarah. It was the first time she'd texted me since our fight. Hi, Mom just told me you're not coming home tomorrow. Why are you celebrating separately? I stared at the screen for a few minutes, wondering whether to respond honestly or diplomatically. Then I decided it was time to stop hiding the truth. I'm throwing my own Thanksgiving this year, I wrote. I want a kid-free party so I can really enjoy the holiday without having to deal with behavioral issues. I hit send and watched as 3 dots appeared and disappeared in the chat, indicating that Sarah was typing and deleting her reply. After about 10 minutes, she finally sent a short message. You're being terrible. You don't want to see your nephews for Thanksgiving. I responded immediately, not wanting to leave any room for guesswork. It's nothing personal, Sarah. I just want to celebrate quietly and peacefully, without the drama that comes with rude children. The message was immediately read. I saw the tick, but there was no response. I waited for about an hour, expecting her to explode, but nothing came. And the silence was almost louder than any words. Sarah understood exactly what I was talking about, and she realized that my decision was final. Thursday morning, I woke up with a feeling of lightness and anticipation that I hadn't felt in years. I sent congratulations to my parents and Sarah in the family chat, adding a few autumn emojis. Mom and Dad responded with hearts and warm words. Sarah left my message on read, but I was no longer going to let this spoil my mood. I spent the morning busy, cooking the turkey, mixing sauces, setting the table. For the first time in a long time, getting out beautiful china, carefully arranging the glasses, lit candles, and placed an autumn composition of dried leaves and small pumpkins in the center of the table that I had made the day before. My house looked like it came straight out of a magazine, and I felt proud that I was able to create this space myself. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, guests began to arrive. Uncle Mike brought good wine, Aunt Linda brought her famous stuffing, and Cousin David even showed up with a bouquet of flowers, which was an unexpected but very nice addition to my holiday decor. The house was filled with excitement, laughter, people complimenting the atmosphere, saying that I had done everything beautifully. We sat around the table and talked about books, travel, work, and I found myself thinking that this is how a real Thanksgiving should feel, without shouting and chaos, but with warmth and meaningful conversations. I had just brought out the turkey when the doorbell rang. I walked to the front door, wondering who it could be, because all my guests were already here, and I was not expecting anyone else, so my heart was pounding anxiously. And the thought flashed through my mind that perhaps it was a neighbor complaining about the noise or a courier with a mistaken delivery. I opened the door, and at that moment, everything inside me sank. My breath caught, as if someone had pulled the rug out from under my feet. There stood Sarah with all 3 boys, beaming with such a smug smile, as if she had just done a great good for all mankind. "Surprise!" they shouted in unison, and before I could even say anything, the whole storm of human bodies, childish energy and impudence squeezed past me into the house, pushing through the air and breaking the carefully constructed order. I froze at the threshold, feeling how everything I had built over the past few days literally turned to dust in a matter of seconds. My adult quiet party was rapidly turning into the very chaos from which I had escaped, and it seemed to me that all my efforts had been in vain. Sarah, with the air of a queen who had returned to her rightful throne, burst into the dining room without even bothering to ask permission, and plopped down right on my chair at the head of the table, on the very hostess's place where I had been sitting a minute ago. "Hello, everyone. Sorry we're a little late," she announced cheerfully, as if everything was fine, and my guests looked at her with such a mixture of surprise and indignation that I saw how confusion was growing in their eyes. Meanwhile, the boys, as if on cue, rushed to the table, grabbing everything they could find: buns, pieces of stuffing, even the turkey they almost touched. They sat right on the floor in the living room, chewing and dropping crumbs, and Alessandro, noticing the remote control, instantly turned on the TV and turned the volume up to maximum so that the shrill sounds of the cartoon echoed throughout the house, drowning out all conversations. The guests looked at each other in horror. Aunt Linda had a strained, painfully polite smile on her face. Uncle Mike looked at me with the obvious expectation that I would intervene. And my cousin David leaned over to his elderly mother and quietly said, "Mom, your headache is coming on again. Let's go." "Oh, come on, don't go," Sarah said loudly. "The children are just happy to be here." But Aunt Carol was already buttoning her coat and picking up her handbag, her eyes full of apologetic sadness. "Sorry, dear, but the noise is too loud," she whispered in my ear, and I saw the other guests begin to fidget uncomfortably, clearly thinking about following her example. At that moment, I felt my anger rise up in me, and grabbing Sarah's arm, I pulled her sharply from her chair. "Into the kitchen!" I muttered through clenched teeth and dragged her there, closing the door tightly. "What the hell are you doing?" I hissed, barely keeping my voice in check. "I told you clearly that this is an adults-only evening." Sarah pretended not to understand, her face a mask of innocence, which only added fuel to the fire. "The boys were very eager to see you," she drawled in her honeyed voice. "I thought it would be a pleasant surprise." But her words cut into me like a knife, and at that moment a crash came from the living room, followed by children's squeals. We ran back out, and what I saw made me go cold. My new, huge 65-inch TV, for which I had saved every extra penny for months, had a crack running diagonally, like black lightning. The screen was completely shattered, and now my $2,000 pride was a useless piece of glass. The children sat on the couch with guilty faces, but no one said a word. "Who did this?" I asked, and silence hung in the air. Then Uncle Mike quietly cleared his throat. It was Alessandro. His brother changed the channel to something else, and he threw the remote at the TV. I closed my eyes, feeling the world crumble. 2,000 were gone, all because of a whim of a 7-year-old. "Sarah," I said in a trembling voice, "your son just broke my TV. You owe me $2,000 back." She looked at me, then at the screen, and laughed. "Are you serious?" she drawled. "It was just an accident. Kids break things sometimes. It's not the end of the world, Daniela." I felt something break inside me. "Get out." "Take the kids and leave now," I said coldly, and she must have realized I wasn't joking because she began hurriedly dressing the boys, muttering something about my insanity. The kids whined that they didn't want to leave, but Sarah wasn't listening. At the threshold, already pulling their coats on, she suddenly turned around and shouted, "This is exactly why no one likes you. You're mean, selfish, and you hate children." The door slammed shut behind them, and there was silence, broken only occasionally by the rustling of awkwardly shuffling guests. And then Uncle Mike cleared his throat and said, clearly trying to lighten the mood, "Well, this holiday has finally become interesting. One by one, my guests politely excused themselves and left, as if each of them wanted to leave the house as quickly as possible, where tension and irritation were in the air and where the holiday had turned into a disaster, so that an hour later, my wonderful Thanksgiving dinner ended in complete failure, and I was left alone in my house, looking at the broken television and a pile of food scattered on the floor, as if after a barbarian invasion. I stood in the middle of the living room for a long time, unable to move, and only after some time, when the shock began to subside, I picked up a rag and garbage bags, deciding that the rest of the evening would be devoted to cleaning, although every minute of this work only increased my anger, because I thought about the fact that in the 6 weeks since buying the television, I had only managed to get used to it a little, and now my $2,000 disappeared as ingloriously as a candle flame disappears in a strong gust of wind. The next morning, still seething with anger, I went to my parents, hoping to find support there at least, but as soon as I entered the kitchen, I realized that they already knew everything. My mother, clearing the table, quietly asked if it was true that Alessandro had broken the TV and that Sarah had only laughed when I demanded compensation for the damage. I nodded, feeling my insides tighten with resentment, and answered, "Yes, that's exactly what happened." And my father just sighed and said, "She told us it was an accident." I couldn't help but exclaim, "It wasn't an accident, Dad. Even if it was an accident, she still has to pay for it." But my mother, shaking her head gently, said in the same tone in which she consoled me as a child, "Daniela, you know Sarah doesn't have that kind of money. Maybe you should just forget about it." I looked at her with wide eyes and almost didn't believe that I was hearing these words. "Forget? Mom, it's $2,000. She only quietly answered, "I know, honey, it's a lot of money, but family is more important than anything." I left them that day with a feeling of complete emptiness, as if even my parents did not want to see the injustice in this situation and preferred to justify Sarah, although at the time they would never have tolerated such behavior from me. In the evening, I sat in my living room, looking at the crack in the black screen and thinking that if no one was going to hold Sarah accountable, then I would do it myself, and at that moment, I made a decision. This year and the next, I would not buy gifts for either Sarah or her sons, because usually I spent about $300 on each, and over 2 years the amount came to $2,400, which was even more than the cost of my TV. I didn't tell anyone about my plan, just ordered a new screen and switched to preparing for Christmas, buying beautiful, thoughtful gifts for my parents. A watch I had been looking at for a long time for my father, and a set of jewelry for my mother that she had been admiring in a shop window. Christmas Eve arrived, and I knocked on my parents' door around 6 in the evening, holding 2 neatly wrapped packages, having decided in advance that I would not stay long, but only deliver the gifts and leave before the chaos became unbearable. The door was opened by my mother, wearing an apron with an embroidered flower, her hands smelling of fresh cookies, and she happily hugged me, inviting me in. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, I heard familiar sounds, the stamping of feet, shouts, the rattling of furniture, and I immediately understood. Sarah and her boys were already here. Mom and I went into the kitchen, and I quietly said, "I can't stay long. I just wanted to give you and Dad your presents." But when I glanced into the living room, I saw the same scene as Thanksgiving. 3 boys running around the coffee table, knocking over little things, Matteo taking down ornaments from the tree, Alessandro jumping on the couch, and Gustavo crying because he didn't get what he wanted, while Sarah sat in her dad's chair, staring at her phone as if the chaos around her had nothing to do with her. I handed my parents their presents and was about to hurry out when the boys came storming into the kitchen. "Aunt Daniela, where are our presents?" Matteo yelled. "Yeah, where are our Christmas presents?" Alessandro demanded, and little Gustavo just held his hands out to me, expecting me to take out something magical. The parents looked at me with mild anticipation, too, as if it were a given that I had brought something for the kids, too. This was the moment I had been waiting for weeks. I looked straight at the boys and spoke loudly enough for Sarah, who was sitting in the living room, to hear, "I will not be giving you any Christmas presents this year or next. I will use this money to pay back the cost of the TV you broke on Thanksgiving. The reaction was immediate. The 3 boys burst into tears at the same time, as if I had just said the most terrifying words in the world. Gustavo threw himself on the floor, screaming and kicking his legs violently, throwing a tantrum. Alessandro ran as fast as he could towards Sarah, and Matteo stood in the middle of the kitchen with his mouth open, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Mom!" Alessandro screamed. "Aunt Daniela says she's not giving us any Christmas presents." Sarah burst into the kitchen, her face red with anger, her eyes flashing, her lips trembling with indignation, and barely catching her breath, she shouted, "You are vindictive and cruel." "They are only children." I, maintaining a calm that I thought only infuriated her even more, answered firmly, "These are the children who destroyed my property, and their mother refused to take responsibility for it." Sarah, growing increasingly angry, raised her voice to a shrill scream, her words echoing off the kitchen walls. "You're punishing innocent children because of some stupid TV. What kind of person does that? You're the worst sister in the world." I looked at her with cold clarity and said, "The only sister who's acting terribly here is you, Sarah. You don't discipline your children, you don't teach them to respect other people's property, and you don't take responsibility when they cause damage. That's why now they'll learn that there will be consequences for their actions." Sarah turned sharply to our parents as if expecting support and screamed, "Are you going to let her talk to me like that?" But Mom and Dad looked at each other, confused and tired, and although they didn't say a word, it was clear that they too were tired of cleaning up after her children, putting up with their tantrums, and turning a blind eye to her inaction. "Okay," Sarah almost spat, grabbing the crying boys by the hands. "We're leaving! And don't wait for us again." She quickly gathered the children, each of whom was either sobbing or screaming, and running out into the hallway, slammed the front door so hard that my mother's Christmas wreath fell off the hook with a dull thud and rolled across the floor. I just sighed, kissed my parents on the cheek, and quietly said goodbye, after which I went home, deciding to spend this evening the way I wanted, in silence without shouting and chaos. I ordered Chinese food, got out a cozy blanket, turned on old movies that always warmed my heart, and sent short holiday greetings to my friends. To be honest, it was one of the most peaceful Christmases I had had in years, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the holiday belonged to me alone, rather than the endless chaos that Sarah and her children invariably brought. However, just 2 days later, my peace was shattered when, while scrolling through my Facebook feed, I came across a post by Sarah that made my blood boil. The photo showed her 3 crying boys, and underneath the picture was a long caption about how cruel and vindictive I was, how I heartlessly deprived my innocent nephews of Christmas presents, and the post ended with the words, "She's not my sister anymore." The comments under the photo from her friends, filled with outrage and insults towards me, multiplied, and I noticed with bitterness that Sarah liked every single one of them, as if with pleasure adding fuel to the fire. I had already started writing a response post to tell the whole truth about the broken TV, the ruined Thanksgiving, how tired I was of her neglect, but at some point I stopped and deleted what I had written. I didn't need to justify myself to her friends, who had never seen the whole picture and judged only by her words. All our relatives knew perfectly well what had happened, because they had either been there or heard the story from those who had. I decided to act differently. I sent Sarah a private message, writing short and cold. "Since you no longer consider me your sister, perhaps I will stop paying your rent. After all, why should I pay $800 a month for someone who is not my family?" It didn't take long to respond. Sarah read the message literally a few seconds later, and immediately my phone came to life, her name flashing on the screen over and over again. She called 12 times in a row, but I did not answer once. Then the messages started pouring in. "Daniela, please don't do this." I didn't mean what I said. The kids need a place to live. I stubbornly kept quiet. Later, when I checked her page, I noticed that the controversial post had disappeared. completely gone, as if it had never been there. That same night, Sarah wrote again, "Please don't stop paying rent. I can't afford this apartment without your help." But I didn't respond to that message either. 2 months had passed since that Christmas row. I was still paying rent because I couldn't bear the thought of my nephews being on the street, but I had also cut off all contact with Sarah. I visited my parents on days and at times when I knew she and the boys would be gone, usually on weekday evenings when the kids had school the next day. Then one day during one of these visits, my mother cautiously broke some unexpected news to me. "You know, Daniela," she said, "Sarah seems to have been working on the boys' behavior lately. Last Saturday, they actually sat through dinner without throwing food or getting up from the table, and Sarah insisted that they clean up after themselves." Dad nodded, adding, "It's like night and day compared to how they used to behave." My mother looked at me almost pleadingly. Maybe your boundaries really taught her something. Maybe she realized it was time for her to take on the role of a real parent. Maybe we should try to make peace, let the boys come over again? But I shook my head and answered firmly, "I'm not ready for that yet. I want to see real, lasting change before I open the door again. A couple of nice dinners aren't going to erase months of chaos and a broken TV.